I'd like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The Nalanda School of Public Health is committed to reminding ourselves and our community of this history as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. But for the School of Public Health, it's also a very happy commitment because we're now the home of the Waakabee-Nez-Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health, and we have the opportunity to advance Indigenous issues in the university. Welcome all to this very special keynote lecture on health and human rights. May I first offer my thanks to Peter Warriam and Margaret Hobeneck for the Peanut Foundation support, and my congratulations to Professor Lisa Forman for organizing tonight's keynote lecture and a fantastic symposium that we're going to have tomorrow. This is a particularly delightful occasion for me for two reasons. One of them is that I've had the privilege of being in the health and human rights space for some time, served on the board of Physicians for Human Rights and led several fact-finding missions related to human rights and health. And I guess the message to many of the young people in this room is that, in fact, there are incredibly strong roles that health and public health professionals can play in using their skills to both protect and advance human rights, and conversely, shed light on how human rights considerations play a unique and special role in the decisions that are made regarding health policies that affect millions. Second is that I had the pleasure of being a colleague of Professor Sen's, that is, on the faculty of Harvard, where I was for 18 years, although admittedly considerably less well known than our speaker here. Having had that experience, I'll note that Professor Sen was known throughout the university not just for being one of its many Nobel Prize winners, but also for being an intellectual polymath and having the profoundly broad range of scope of being able to discuss rhetorically and debate just about anything. As one example, some of you may be aware that one of the most popular among the many books he's published is one that carries the title, The Argumentative Indian. I tease my wife, whose heritage is from Andhra Pradesh, a state in India, that this book is about her. But in fact, it is a collection of essays that discusses in a cogent, pithy, and approachable way India's history and identity, focusing on its traditions of public debate and intellectual pluralism. By the way, Rani is herself a health and human rights scholar who's been at Oxfam and at the Harvard School of Public Health. Given his immense talents, even within Harvard, units would fight with each other for the privilege of having Professor Sen guest lecture, visit, and discuss their issues of choice. And some units, like the Harvard School of Public Health, where I was, even managed to persuade him to accept another of many faculty cross-appointments. Professor Sen, I don't recall you attending any of our general faculty meetings, but I would say you were there in spirit. Seriously speaking, of course, we're deeply honored and privileged to have him with us today. In terms of health, Professor Sen has made enormous contributions, illuminating, for example, the complexities underlying the issue of sex selection abortions in Asia, the role of liberty, rights, addiction, and tobacco control policies. In fact, he did some seminal work right after Prabhat and colleagues published their work on tobacco control for the World Health Organization. And indeed, the very essence of why and how health is a human right is so important to society. And now the School of Public Health, I'm very proud to say, is one of the few schools in North America that have made an explicit commitment to not only recognizing and promoting the connection between human rights and health, but leveraging its substantial history and body of scholars working at the intersection of philosophy, ethics, and public and global health to create an initiative in this area. I am thus very pleased to introduce our very own Professor Lisa Forman, who will in turn introduce Professor Sen and chair this event. Professor Forman occupies the Canada Research Chair in Human Rights and Global Health Equity. She is also director of the Comparative Program on Health and Society at the Munk School of Global Affairs. An expert in a number of different areas, such as the role of international human rights in access to medicines in low and middle-income countries, Professor Forman has already garnered a number of honorifics, most recently the 2015 Ludwig and Estelle Juice Memorial Human Rights Prize. Please welcome Professor Lisa Forman.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Lisa Forman. I have been the primary lead in organizing this conference, and it's a tremendous pleasure and a tremendous honor to welcome you to this very special keynote lecture by Professor Amartya Sen, which initiates a symposium on human rights and the social determinants of health, which will continue all day tomorrow. There's been the most extraordinary public response to this symposium. Certainly, we understand that part of it is the public hunger to engage with these topics, but certainly the extraordinary star power of Professor Sen, our keynote speaker tonight, has played a significant role. I want to thank Howard for that wonderful, very generous introduction and for the very generous support you've provided for this event. I in particular want to thank Peter Warrian and Margaret Hovanak of the Lupina Foundation, who have very, very generously funded and supported this symposium. About a year and a half ago, when Peter suggested that we put on a moonshot event on human rights and the social determinants of health with a dream keynote, I had not a second's hesitation in responding with Amartya Sen's name. His work on development, inequality, poverty, and human rights profoundly influenced me as a grad student. It changed not only the way that I saw the world, but how I thought about it. It's a powerful, visceral experience that's clearly very widely shared. From the selection committee which awarded Professor Sen the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1998 for his work on social choice theory, the multiple other institutions and countries which have awarded him their highest honors, including the Bharat Ratna from India and the National Humanities Medal from the USA, and the 102 universities worldwide which have awarded him honorary doctorates. Professor Sen is a polymath who has made prodigious and world-shaping contributions to welfare and development economics, economic theory, social choice theory, gender studies and feminist economics, and legal, ethical, and moral philosophy, in over 30 books translated into over 30 languages and over 300 articles. One of Professor Sen's signal contributions is the concept of human development, which in contrast to a purely economic development focused purely on growing the wealth of economies, which Professor Sen has argued is only a part of life itself, aims instead to increase the richness of human life. This conception of human development is rooted in Professor Sen's capabilities approach. The idea that human development should aim to expand a person's capabilities to be healthy, well-nourished, knowledgeable, and active in community life. And that this outcome could be achieved by removing the obstacles to such capabilities, from illiteracy and ill health to inadequate public facilities, to systematic social deprivation and tyranny. In Professor Sen's articulation, a capabilities approach asks development to treat people as active agents of change rather than passive recipients of dispensed benefits. And it seeks to maximize human agency, both as the best outcome of development and an essential condition for achieving it. Professor Sen's capabilities approach has been enormously influential. It's at the heart of the Human Development Reports, which the UNDP began to issue in 1990. It has spawned philosophical subfields. It has deeply influenced global policy. In Professor Sen's work, human rights are central, both as democratic safeguards to inform and, if necessary, protest policies with adverse social and economic impacts, and as grounding the imperative to invest in education and health as intrinsically and instrumentally valuable development outcomes. His philosophical work on human rights and justice has made great contributions to the conceptualization of the right to health and theories of justice, including his 2009 book, The Idea of Justice. Professor Sen's work raises questions that are absolutely central to this conference, about how we might understand the intersections between human rights and the social determinants of health, and about what a human rights approach aimed at maximizing human agency might require of policy and programs. We are privileged and honored to welcome the wider community here at the university and in Toronto to Professor Amartya Sen.
Good evening. Well, I'm very happy and feel privileged to be here today, and I'd like to thank those who welcomed me just now, over generously, but I will not complain about that, and those who invited me, and all of you for coming here. I was told to speak on health and human rights, and I'm going to do that. But I begin with a poem, a line of a poem by Tennyson, written about a bit over 150 years ago. He is writing to Virgil, the great Latin poet, and it begins, I salute thee, Mantovano. Well, what's Mantovano? Well, Virgil was born in Mantua, and Mantovano is Tennyson's way of describing someone who is from Mantua. But what's salute? Literally, it meant good health. Now, is Tennyson wishing Virgil good health, who had been dead for some 1,000 years? Actually, more like 2,000 years. Well, what it shows is that health is regarded as so central that the word salute, which began by saying good health to you, has ended up being a general greeting, because what could be more important than health? And in some languages, like in Italian, where saluto exists, in both senses, you see that. In English, if I said salute, I don't think people would think about health. On the other hand, there are adaptations from which we can see that original use was quite important in English at some stage. And now, of course, it's become just generally being good, like something being salutary. Now, I think it's important to recognize that, because in the centrality of health, one can find the beginning of the idea as to why it should be seen as such a principal human right. And there's a long history. I began with a Western example, but if I were to begin with a Eastern example, in fact, from my own country, if you think about the great moment of Indian recognition of wanting to go beyond what one is learning, namely the time when Gautam Buddha, by the way, the word very difficult to convey into a Western audience, because the Western audience is absolutely convinced that it's pronounced Buddha, which would make him, in some languages, mean old, rather than Buddha meaning the wise one. So I'm going to use the Sanskrit version of it. The great moment in Buddha's life is when he decides, very young man, young prince, at the foothills of, in a kingdom in the foothills of Himalayas, when he decides to he's very dissatisfied and decides to leave home and seek enlightenment. What makes him do that? But the three things that are mentioned is one is mortality. One day he encounters a dead body being carried away. Morbidity, he finds a very old person suffering from lack of care and lack of cure. And disability, you see, in the very disabled person, disabled by old age, struggling. Now, all three are concerned with health. Now, of course, Buddha's own thinking went on to many other speculations about the nature of the universe, including the nature of God, on which people tend to forget now. He didn't arrive at a firm answer. He remained agnostic throughout his life, on the grounds, which actually very often worth recollecting, on the grounds that one, you would never be able to settle the issue, and two, you don't have to settle the issue to behave well, because the compulsion to act well should not come from trying to please some being other than yourself. It must come from your recognizing something as good, and therefore you ought to do it. But amidst these speculations and other things, the concern with human life remained very strong, so much so that as Buddhism developed in India, where people often forget, now that India is becoming a rather narrowly communal country of one particular religion, which I happen to be technically share, but also can't forget the fact that it is a secular democracy we are talking about, even though the treatment of some of the people not belonging to that faith has often been quite terrifyingly bad in recent years. But despite the problems that could be sort of being generated in that period, if you're proud of ancient India, you have to recognize that for 1,000 years the country was a Buddhist country. And from all accounts, the healthcare situation was a great deal better. In fact, it's rather striking that when the microphone is not working very well, but it might be. Yeah. I have something on my tie. It took me quite some time when I came to the West to find out why one wears a tie, until I discovered that it is for a microphone to be attached. And for hundreds of years, the European civilization was growing without knowing why they are wearing this tie, until electricity intervened. But I don't know whether I'm better now. Am I? Okay, good. So one of the institutions that Buddhism led to was Nalanda University, which is actually the world's oldest university, established in the 5th century. It was good 600 years, more than 600 years before Bologna was born. And it didn't survive. It was destroyed as an attack from Middle Eastern invaders. But in its heyday, it had 10,000 students drawn from India, China, Korea, Japan, and all over East Asia. In fact, Nalanda, which I was privileged to be chancellor of in a revived form, a revival which is under certain strain now, Nalanda was the only institution outside China to which any ancient Chinese ever went for higher education. And among its faculties, one of the great faculties was the Faculty of Medicine. and perhaps the first systematic comparative study of medicine was produced by a 7th century Chinese scholar who was a student in Nalanda called Yi Jin, and he wrote a great book, of which 3 chapters, 2.5 chapters are devoted to comparative medicine. But he arrives ultimately at a rather interesting conclusion that in terms of pure medical science, while Nalanda was doing well and India was doing well, the Chinese was certainly no worse, in fact maybe better. And indeed, in some respects, particularly in dealing with saving lives, the Chinese did better than Indians. But rather amazingly, for anyone who is familiar with Indian public health today, he thought the public health care was better in India than in China. Now, one of the things that's absolutely not true now is that, but evidently it was true at some stage. But he was not the only one. If he came in the 7th century, in early 5th century came Faxian, or Faxian as he is spelled out in the New Fenian spelling, and he was full of public health care and medical care and hospitals in Patna and Pataliputra. So this is a tradition that goes back, and I can quote from other parts of the world. So health has been recognized to be a very central feature of life. And that's the beginning of the idea of human rights. What is a human right? Human right is something which we think a person should have. It's a right for a person to have. We should do anything possible in order to make that right realized. Why is it human? Well, it pertains to human beings, but it's not only that, it comes to you by virtue of your humanity, not by virtue of your being, say, Canadian citizen or British citizen or whatever. And so it's a human right, it's a right that we recognize to be very important, and because you're a human being. Now, what's the idea of a right? Right is something which the judgment is that you ought to have it, and B, if we can help to make it possible for people to have it, all people to have it, we have some kind of an obligation to help in that enterprise. This is not a lecture on philosophy, which I'm afraid is one of the subjects I teach, but Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher of the 18th century, distinguishes between, he calls perfect obligation and imperfect obligation. Perfect obligation, if I borrow a book from you, it's perfect obligation that I should return it. It's well specified, book to be returned, the agency is specified by me, and the subject is also specified, namely to you. Imperfect obligation is not like that, but it is an obligation. In fact, people often don't recognize that Kant wrote more about imperfect obligation than about perfect obligation. Lawyers often forget that, because human rights in this form doesn't belong to the domain of law. It precedes law. Now, the duty that we have is a duty for all. Now, some people may have more perfect obligation, as Canada has decided that the state has an obligation to provide it. And as America has not yet decided, I don't know what happened in the debate today, that it is a right that could be discussed along with many other claims to money. Doesn't have any priority. Some kind of a modified, somewhat limited perspective in what is now called Obamacare, but that might soon go, and the whole issue is about pre-existing conditions. A human right doesn't stand waiting for it to be shown that it's not a pre-existing condition which makes you entitled to get that help. For a state, if you take the European or the Canadian view, that becomes a perfect obligation. But for anyone who can help, it remains an imperfect obligation. It's an important distinction. And if I may use an example I sometimes use in class, that when we think about that terrible occasion when Kitty Genovese was killed in Queens in broad daylight, not broad daylight, but in the view of people who could see them but didn't come and help. 60 people or more saw that. Now, in the case of Kitty Genovese, what did happen? Well, her right to live and not to be assaulted was violated, certainly. Most important thing. The assaulter and the murderer violated a perfect obligation not to do that kind of thing. And all those who watched and did not do anything violated the imperfect obligation that they ought to ask, what can I do in this case? Now, we can all think of so many different things that we cannot intervene in every case. We have to think and judge what I may be expected to do, what others are expected to do, and so on. And what can I actually do? I can't be at 60 different places. I was teaching a course 3 years ago in the medical school with Paul Forman, and he's not only a great doctor. This was happening when the Ebola epidemic was coming in. We taught this class in one day afternoon, and in the evening he would fly off again to Africa and then come back on Sunday night and give this talk on Monday and go away. And I think he's the only one I know who tries to be at many different places simultaneously. Rwanda, Haiti, Congo, and so on. But it's not so easy to do. So there are limitations, but what is not available to us is to say it's none of my business. It is your business. That's what the point of the assertion of human rights and the imperfect obligation that goes with it. Now, that idea that human rights is some kind of a right was actually impressed in the French Constitution, in what in English we would call rights of man. And shortly after, in the 1780s, when the revolution came to full blossom and happened, the Declaration was also established. By the following year, a great legal theorist and a philosopher, namely Jeremy Bentham, was writing in his book called Anarchical Fallacies why this was all a confusion. There cannot be a right without a law. A right is the child of law. And since there is no right, pre-law, there could be no human right without legislation or reinterpretation of an existing legislation, which is one of the things that my friend Ronald Dworkin was very keen on emphasizing. And on the other hand, could it be that it's a confusion about the nature of human rights? The claim isn't it's a legal right. The claim is it has great importance. Many years later, a friend of mine, now that I'm pretty old, whenever I say friend of mine, I often have to say, alas, no longer, Herbert Hart, from whom I learned a lot, professor of jurisprudence in Oxford, wrote an article in the 1950s saying, surely what the French Constitution meant, the French Declaration meant, was that it should be law, not that it is already law. So what he did was to see human rights not as a child of law, in which case Bentham's criticism would be valid, but as parents of law, in which case it will not be valid, because it's inspiring people to do a legislation. Now that's the way things have happened. Even the American Declaration of Independence begins with every individual has inalienable rights. It went on to say given by God. The French Constitution makes a similar declaration without invoking God. But in both cases, the rights come first, the legislation comes later. But if you think it would be a good parent of law, because it's important, well, law is not the only way of bringing about greater fulfillment of that good thing. So everything that can contribute to it, including taking care of the social determinants of health, must be part of the obligation that human rights generates. And that's the form in which it has increasingly been taken for those who took that. Now, of course, having a national health service, like in Europe, like in Canada, could be very important part of it. But there are other things too. There may be need for epidemiology, which is very important. Need for particularly eradication of epidemics, general care about nutrition and food, so that nutrients of various kinds, including micronutrients, are met. And also need for restraining certain types of food, excessive consumption of fat and sugar. If you can not have trans fat, you don't need a legislation in order to encourage those moves. So the existence of human rights, which the form it took, immediately establishes all that. Now, the debate that was taking place in the 1789 to 91, 92 period, just after the French Revolution, was Bentham denying that there could be such a thing as human rights, whereas Mary Wollstonecraft, perhaps the most underestimated original thinker of the 18th century, also as it happened, the pioneering feminist economist, feminist thinker, writing two books, respectively in 1790 and 1792. 1790 on Vindication of the Rights of Men, where she is actually very critical of the Declaration of Independence. Why? Not because he was opposed to American independence, but he thought that you cannot declare independence and assert rights on behalf of some people and not others, namely the slaves. And the existence, and I remember being struck when I first read the sentence, because here is a very radical English woman writing on what basis he's criticizing Edmund Burke. What basis Mr. Burke applauds the Declaration of Independence, I fail to understand. I had to ask the question, why is this radical revolutionary English woman saying such a peculiar thing? Well, the peculiar thing is that you're arguing, he's arguing that, she is arguing that there's a contradiction whereby you accept rights for some, but do not abolish slavery and do not accept those rights for others, namely the African Americans, brought forcibly there to that country. And that didn't go into the women's issue particularly. I would say the main contribution of the Wollstonecraft first book is what he says about slavery. There were a number of people coming on, writing on similar subjects. Adam Smith, among economists, a totally committed abolitionist, and many others. Marquis de Condorcet, the French theorist of French Revolution, and many others. Not all of them necessarily accepted that. It's not to the credit of David Hume that despite brilliant thought, he seemed to hesitate on that subject about whether all people, including black Africans, have equal rights and indeed are equally capable of rights as European. Now, it's an interesting point, since Adam Smith has been captured by the right wing, that to recognize that that's not only, that's by the way generally wrong because he was very keen on state intervention, but you don't find a single passage in Adam Smith where there is any doubt. There's one passage where yesterday there was a dinner at Harvard president and Drew's house, and this question came up, and he asked me whether Smith says something specifically about slaves, and I said many, and one example I gave was Smith saying, and he used the word Negro there isn't a single Negro in the entire coast of Africa whose sense of whose sense of magnanimity so far exceeds what his sordid master is able to comprehend, that we have to re-examine the institutions which are based on an asymmetry of which almost exactly the opposite is true. Now, I think this was a hyperbole that Smith liked doing. It's not a claim that Africans are superior to Europeans, but the claim is that in this respect there isn't a difference, which is of course mainly Smith's position. He, like he did, and he also did about, if in the Q&A it comes up, I can tell you about how he dealt with the Irish-English relationship, but I think it will take me too long to get on to that. So that battle was being fought on grounds of the human rights of slaves, with some of the greatest 18th century thinkers joining that, and then in the 19th century too, like John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, and others. It's often forgotten that Karl Marx, I remember when reading Capital, Volume 1, at one stage he asked the question, 1860s then, is anything good happening in the world? And I thought what he would say, well, yes, maybe 1848 Paris Commune, but not. What he says, the only good thing that's happened recently are the American Civil Wars, because it led to the liberation of the slaves. Now, this is from a man who would regard that the liberated slave who became a wage laborer, say in Chicago, is in some sense wage slave. But he's not identifying wage slave with actual slave. And this is the point that becomes important. Since I spent some time teaching justice, in the theory of justice, I have a book called Idea of Justice, you have to recognize that you can't be just perfect just and nothing. There are gradations you can think of. And slavery fitted well into it. Now, if you haven't read Mary Wollstonecraft, I would strongly recommend that, but among other things, she said most of these things that we are interested in can be advanced to some extent by legislation, but also by many other things, including public discussion. The media, who is talking about what? Who finds what funny? Women drivers being a subject of joke was itself a matter. That's not her example, as you can see, there was no motor cars at that time. But she gives many examples where conversation could make a difference. So that when we come to the social determinants of health, we have to think about epidemiology, we have to think of many other things. We have to think about what people are discussing. Can you go on discussing public policy without giving the priority that health demands? And education demands too, you could say. It's also the case that there are many other features, as discussed by Michael Marmot, Wilkinson, and many others, like inequality, which actually has a gigantic effect on health, because it turns out being sat upon and ordered around makes your life shorter and harder, and illness is greater. That was one of the first studies, was Michael Marmot's study called the Whitehall Study. Whitehall is where the English bureaucrats hung around, and he looks at different layers from top brass to the bottom. The top brass lived much longer, had much fewer illnesses. And as you go down the ladder, the life expectancy falls until at the bottom the life expectancy is almost only half of the life expectancy of the top brass. Partly difference in income, what you can afford, but partly also being ordered around is not very good for your health. Why not? Is inequality a cause like malaria or heart disease? It isn't. But these diseases are inspired and are influenced by, I think, by your behavior. So if you're sitting all day being ordered around at the end of the day, unlike the top brass who goes home and gets on the bike and has a little shower, this tendency to go to a pub and have 5 beers is quite large. Smoking is a natural way of recompensing the terrible nature of misery in one's life. So the statistical correlation between inequality, income inequality, and particularly inequality of freedom, and bad health and early death is very large indeed. So I think we have to think about all these issues in dealing with health policy, including inequality generally. That should not stop one's agitation for health care. Health does depend on health care. So some people who take social determinants too seriously might argue that health care is not so important. It's very important, but not the only thing that's important. And the importance lies in the fact that health is so important that it is a human right, and that it's something that has made people, whether in the East and the West, leave their home, think about what is to be done, and had led also to some of the greatest engagement in interaction with each other, including in our language, so much so that the word salute has come to mean taking off your hat rather than taking on your stethoscope to check somebody's heartbeat. So I think that's really what the subject of my talk is. Thank you very much. I should explain before panic fits in that because of one leg being metal and the other leg needing metal but not yet got it, if I stand at a place for an hour, it's like cement, it settles down. And so it's very difficult. I have to make the blood start circulating, and then I can go. And when I first did it, I had real difficulty. People from the audience thought I was having a heart attack, and immediately offered various guidance. I think I'm beginning to get there, yeah. So are you going to help me with taking the question? Yeah, all right. Okay. So on my way journey back, I'm going to take your help. Last thing I wanted to fall. But in about 2 minutes, I'll be able to demonstrate that I can walk. In fact, I've not been complimented so much on my walk since I was 2.
Thank you very much, Amartya. I think maybe, let me see where we are time-wise. I'll ask you maybe one question or so before I open up to what I do not doubt is a very eager audience who want to engage with you. I'm very struck by your articulation of rights as preceding law. I'm also very aware of the fact that you live in Boston, in the US at a very particular time, where pre-existing conditions are the lingua franca for excluding healthcare.
Not in Boston so much.
Right.
Not yet.
Well, my question for you, and I was wondering maybe we should think of human rights as the original pre-existing condition. I wonder what your thoughts are on how resilient ideas like human rights and the social determinants are in the kind of political and economic upheavals that we're seeing right now, Brexit, Trump's election.
Well, Brexit recognized what may look like a right, and in my judgment, ignored a number of other things which are actually, after critical discussion, would be accepted to be right. What it took on was the idea that if you have a majority vote, and the majority is in one direction, then the government has some reason to try to do that. In the form that you have to do that, I believe it's just not right. You would not have having referendum is not a way of running a country. And in the days when Britain produced great authors like John Stuart Mill, he wrote a whole book on that subject called Representative Government, as to why a representative government may be guided by a plebiscite and then debated and then rejected. The idea of a representative government is that it allows you an opportunity to have public engagement. And the fact is that what happened here was exactly the opposite. A vast majority of parliamentarians in Britain were against Brexit. But they were so impressed by a 52-48 victory on the other side, and led by the Prime Minister of the country, they decided the debate is over. As someone like Wittgenstein would have pointed out, a statement like Britain has decided could not be correct, because has decided has a much stronger meaning than one plebiscite in which the case for Brexit was so adorned with falsehoods, like how much money Britain would save, by withdrawing from Euro, and how all that will go into National Health Service. Both these statements were withdrawn the day after the vote, but the vote had already taken place. But somehow, it didn't occur to the Prime Minister or the parliamentarian that that in any way affected the validity of even the plebiscite, even though plebiscite isn't a good way of ruling. So when the Parliament met, all these majority who were in favor of staying on said, since Britain has already decided, there is nothing more to discuss. Now that meant a representative government is not going to do what John Stuart Mill was hoping it would do, namely represent the people and then debate. And since it happened to have a leader of the opposition at this time, and I'm being prejudiced as a long-time supporter of Labour Party, since the present leader of the opposition neither leads nor opposes, what you have is that the opposition immediately declared that the government has won. And therefore, even though Jeremy Corbyn himself was against, again, I gather, against Brexit. So somehow, I mean, it breaks my heart, since even though in India we have a long tradition of public discussion, which I think is very central, even according to John Stuart Mill, to democracy. In fact, he thought democracy is government by discussion. Even though we have a long tradition, as far as the basic institutional framework is concerned, the world has learned from Britain to find that Britain has completely forgotten what it has taught the world is, I guess, a sign of fallibility of everything in the world. But it's a very sad fallibility. Now, as far as these issues are concerned, I think once you have gone away from people's right to raise issues, express a view, wanting it to be discussed, and then have the discussion, I would regard that to be a very big democratic right. That's gone. It's gone in India too, to a great extent, right now. Especially if you come from a minority faction, either because of your religion, or minority because you don't happen to agree with the government. That's not a minority, by the way. It's called majority. The government was elected on a 31% vote. But it's what is called plurality. That's what Mr. Trump had in the Republican primaries. At least 3 of the other candidates could have defeated Trump in a one-to-one, head-to-head contest. But that wasn't it. It was all of them put together. And the one with the plurality, namely the highest, wins. Mr. Trump lost the first 18 primaries. He didn't get majority. Then eventually he did, because pretty much all the other candidates were eliminated then. Something like it, that is going on in France right now. Again, a plurality-based system. And a majority-based system would have demanded something. I won't go into that, because anyone who is interested, my colleague Eric Maskin and I have a paper, and well, we did do something in New York Times, but more easily accessible is New York Review of Books. And in that we discuss what majority rule demands and why it isn't plurality. So in the case of Brexit, they did get a majority, but under these very strange circumstances, not at all any that would say that it's decided, it's finished, the debate is over.
I'd like to open up. We have microphones in the room. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Please. Yeah. Or why don't you come up if...
Yeah, actually, I think there is an opaque stand in between you and me.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I can. Oh, no, you are not. You are helping, yeah.
Sir, you very appropriately started with the discussion of public health with the Lord Buddha of India. I think his personal contribution to public health was institution and strategies of stress management that he introduced personally. And as a result of the research or enlightenment, you may call it, he discovered that the morbidity and the disability was a result of people not looking after their glaciers, their stress levels. And he himself was personally responsible for teaching the public.
Sorry, who was?
Lord Buddha himself.
Lord Buddha, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The various meditation techniques to manage their stress. AMA has a study recently published that 65 to 85% of primary care doctors' visits are stress-related. And yet, no doctor gives them any stress management advice. So we talk of public health on one side, and then we close our eyes on the other side. Stress. Your university at Harvard, they've done a lot of work. They have come up with an alternative model to determinants of health, how to deal with them, other than throwing money at the problem. They have come up with an eco-biodevelopmental model of dealing with the determinants of health.
Yeah.
And stress is a major thing in
Sorry,
that.
do you want to place your question?
My question is, how about education in stress management as a strategy in public health?
That's a statement.
Yes.
Your question is, do I agree? And the answer is yes. I agree. But if you want me to say something more, I'll say three more things. One, it is important to do innovative medical control research, and that's one of the reasons I tend to teach a course, sometimes in medical school, sometimes in public health school. I stopped for the last 3 years. Secondly, even without that, most countries have progressed way faster than South Asia has, and India in particular has. Actually, even Bangladesh has done wrong. Over the last 20 years, over the last 25 years, India, which had 50% higher income than Bangladesh, has broadened the gap to become twice per capita income of Bangladesh. And yet, 25 years ago, India had 3 years greater life expectancy than Bangladesh. Now it has 3 years less life expectancy than Bangladesh. India has about 75% complete immunization. Bangladesh has close to 95%. China has about 100%. About 25 years ago, if you look at the 6 South Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, India was second from top, Sri Lanka being on top. Now it's second from bottom. And it holds that position only because Pakistan has become so dysfunctional. But compared with Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, India has slipped. It's actually an amazingly bad record, not just of the present government. My third point is that throwing money, as you say, is a bad thing. But spending money is not such a bad thing. If you have money, you shouldn't throw it. You should use that. And the fact that China spends more than 3% of its income, GDP, on public health care by the government, and India spends barely more than 1%, does make a difference.
I'd like to invite people who do want to ask questions to maybe come line up on the sides and
It would be good if the question could be shorter and more question-y.
Sure thing, I'll make this quick. I just want to start by saying thank you so much for coming here and speaking with us today. My friend Claire and I came from University of Ottawa, and we study international development there, and so we made the trek here to see you, and so it's such an honor.
Well, greetings to you from Toronto.
And so my question was, so I come here, I'm actually a 3-time cancer survivor, and I've been reading a lot of research on the World Health Organization has came out and said that beef and processed meats are carcinogens and they directly cause cancer. And so sort of having that in mind, the environmental impacts of eating meat and the health impacts of it as well interests me a lot. And so I wondered, just in your opinion, if you think there is an intersection with animal rights and with human rights, or if so, how that would work, or if it would sort of overlap.
So I'm not quite certain what it is. Did you get exactly what I'm being asked to address?
The question was whether you see an interaction between animal rights and human
Oh,
rights.
animal rights.
Yes, and in terms of health as well, too.
Well, I'm not very observant, so I haven't yet gone into that subject, but maybe you can give me a little reading list on that, okay? So that's the deal. You give me the reading list, and I will try to get a good answer to your question. But it's an important subject, by the way, because I think we were discussing Buddha earlier, even in the first question talk began with that in some ways there is the kind of attitude that makes us worry about human welfare, a part of that must apply to animal welfare also because they're sensory beings. And while I don't know the recent literature, I can quote some ancient literature. There's a Buddhist document called Sutta Nipata, where Buddha is arguing, essentially in terms of present-day theory of justice, against the social contract view. And he's saying that if you see something which is good, then you should have an obligation to do it without asking whether others are doing it or without asking what others will do for you. So do unto others what you would like them to do is what he is going against. He's saying do unto that others what you think you ought to do anyway, no matter what it does. And he gives us an example that when a mother cares for a child, the main consideration isn't what the child would now or ever in the future do to the mother. The main consideration is that the child cannot do certain things for itself. The infant cannot do certain things for itself, which the mother can. And that already establishes an obligation. And from that point onward, and this should interest you, goes on to say why a similar relationship exists between human beings who can inflict lots of harm on animals without their ability to inflict any harm on us. So I recommend Sutta Nipata.
In your life, I suspect you have acquired a measure of judgment, perhaps inclusive of wisdom. If you could share
Can
with
you
us,
hold it closer?
using your judgment, throughout your life, you have acquired a measure of judgment, inclusive of wisdom, I suspect, strongly. If you could share with us, in your judgment, are our institutions economic, our institutions civic, social, inclusive of our institutions medical health, strong enough to withstand the polarization which is now being introduced, what some would term as Trumpism or populism? Is man strong enough in the normative sense to withstand these vicissitudes?
Yeah. You know, I think both the range and reach of our concerns, as well as the reach of institutions, has to have the breadth of understanding that concepts like social determinants of health, in the case of health, the social determinants of real education, in the case of education, and many other things do, because all of them depend on a variety of things. Now, as we were talking earlier, I think we share a college, namely Trinity. Is that right? Trinity College, Cambridge. So when I studied there, but when I became, I mean, you know that, but when I became the head of the college, master of Trinity, I was often being asked, because that was the question that the British public discussion very much wanted to emphasize. Do you want to put greater focus on science, or on humanities, on social sciences? And I have to say, without being ashamed, that we have to put emphasis on all of them. And it's absolutely not correct to predetermine that this focus has to be on physics rather than on medicine, or on biology rather than Shakespeare, and so on. So I don't think we would arrive at a general formula about how to prioritize that, getting a wise system. I think the wise system there is to judge each of the proposals we have. Follow Buddha, namely, consider what you can do and what the impact of that would be. I'm making Buddha sound more, in terms of modern philosophy, consequentialist, but he was a consequentialist too. Not just that, but that too. And see what the effect of it would be. Does Trump worry about consequences? I think probably does, but the suspicious may be that the reach of the consequences may be rather limited, namely which class and which group of people in the nation and so forth. But I'm not going to debate, having just left the United States this morning. I'm not going to go into US politics.
Hi. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on the concept of a basic income as a human right.
The question is about basic income. Let me explain what the idea of basic income is. Basic income is the idea that everyone should have some income not on grounds of doing something like working and being paid a wage, but on grounds, let's say, in a country, being a citizen. Now, some people are utterly opposed to it on grounds that you have to earn. Now, this is a common view, and you can make it sound plausible if you don't say you have to earn to deserve it, because the idea of desert hasn't yet come in. But to say, unless you work in order to be paid, it will be very hard to retain incentives. That was the subject matter that Marx discussed, Karl Marx, in his last book, The Critique of Gotha Program, 1875, where just before that, the German Workers' Party had published their manifesto called Gotha Program, of which Marx said was a critique, where the Gotha Program claims that people should be paid according to their work and nothing else. And Marx argues, and they said that way people's needs would be fulfilled. And Marx said this is a complete confusion of thought. People's needs are not necessarily the same as their ability to work and be productive. And first of all, distinguish. He also begins with um, he's a bit like a school teacher in that early part of the book. And he says, as Gotha program says, all value is created by labor. And he says, what nonsense. Land and natural resources are equally important for the creation of value. This is, by the way, one of the early statements about environmentalism, the environment and nature as a role. Then he goes on to discuss this, and he said, look, people have needs. What is an ideal society? Well, I don't know ideal, he said, but what would be a better society than payment according to work, which Gotha program wants? Well, surely a society where people get what they need, and others work for it, not because of incentives, but because they want to help each other. And came this formula from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Then he ends up by saying, however, you may not be able to do it today because people do need incentives because their minds are still polluted by self-centered thinking. But don't forget the long run objectives, which includes payment according to needs, just because for the moment we are accepting payment according to work and productivity. So he ends up supporting the proposal of German Workers' Party, but on the process gives many lectures to the German Workers' Party about land, about distinction between needs and productivity, but then the need to bring the long-run superiority of needs in mind. Now, basic income is to say, okay, you can't do it for all income, but some part of it everyone should have because everyone has needs. And therefore, basic income is a way of providing that to others. And there has been a lot written on it. I think the best writing, I don't know whether the questioner would agree with me, is in my judgment, my friend Philippe Van Parijs, who has a brilliant book on that subject, as to why the ethical argument could be very strong for this. But there is the feasibility issue. There's also the issue of availability of resources. Because if you're trying to do for, say, in India, and this proposal has been raised by a member of the government too, not in agreement with the rest of the government, but if the proposal is this, that you give people income, in a country which doesn't have enough schools, has incredibly few hospitals, where the primary health centers don't function because they don't get the money, and sometimes because of absenteeism, where there's very difficult to provide primary health care for all, to give people cash may well be seen as a bit of a waste, not a waste, but not as good as providing people with health care. And why? Because health care has certain features which make the market economy, which is how the income proceeds. Income, what does it allow you to do? Make a demand in the market. But without being alternative economics, but very mainstream economics. If you think of two of the giants of 20th century economics, Paul Samuelson, Kenneth Arrow. Paul Samuelson, a paper in 1850s, says there are certain things like collective goods. Unlike a private good, if a good is a private good, my toothbrush is not your toothbrush, you can't use it. On the other hand, my being free from malaria in the surrounding is a public good. My consumption of it, my enjoyment of it doesn't interfere with yours. For those, the market economy is not a good way of allocating. Kenneth Arrow discussed why health care could not be, 1963 American Economic Review, could never be a good subject for the market. Because the patient does not, the market works when the buyer knows what is it that is buying. But if a patient doesn't know why she or he is ill, what medicine is needed, what medicine is available. The market economy has lost the basic efficiency creating informational selection on which it depends. So creating income in an economy with asymmetric information and with collective good may not be always the best thing to do. However, if you take a country like, say, Canada or Germany or Britain, where the basic healthcare needs are met to a great extent, basic education is available there to all, then the question may well be that the rest of that remains may well be best dealt with by basic income. So I'm ready to applaud the movement. There are many technical issues to be taught, but I'm ready to applaud the idea of having basic income in Europe and Canada, not, I would say, in the United States at this time, because of the healthcare gap. The fact that people are really worried that if they lose their job, they may lose their life because they don't have the income to survive. And of course, basic income will do something about that. On the other hand, there are other kinds of things that the same mode of thinking leads to medical neglect. There are a lot of epidemiologic. I mean, America has some of the finest healthcare systems in the world, and at the same time, it is also failure. So in case of America, one has to think about it. In case of Europe, probably the time has come for basic income. In case of India, the time has absolutely not come for it. That's what I would answer to that question. But thanks for asking such an interesting question.
Hi, Dr. Sen. So I would just like to say that that was such a privilege listening to you.
You have to hold it closer.
Okay.
I'm first of all elderly, secondly, hard of hearing, thirdly, I've had an airplane journey.
Okay, noted. So my question is something that I've been asked with. So I'm hoping I can pick your mind, pick your brain, and then go back and say this is according to Dr. Sen. So my question is, do you see diversity as a strength, or in what capacity would you say diversity is a strength? Just because I've learned that, for example, in healthcare, it's easier for more homogeneous cultures or groups like, say, Norway to implement universal healthcare policies or welfare policies than, say, the United States, which is more diverse. So as we stand in the most multicultural city in the world, I would really like to know what your thoughts are on diversity, whether it's a strength or in what capacity is it considered a strength. Thank you.
I think by diversity, you mean diversity of people being around you. I mean, diversity in general is another question. And depending on the context, it could be very good, it could be very bad. If I'm given the same food every day for lunch, I think I would crave for diversity. But if somebody says, if you sleep every night, why don't you have some diversity? I think I might protest. So it would depend on the context and what is it you're talking about. And oddly, to some extent, that may even apply to human beings, but mostly, I would say, the ability to lead a richer life is, I tend to think, is enhanced by having diversity of people around you. And I think there's a longer answer to be given, but that's certainly, I think, as a first premise, the right thing to do. Now, if it turns out that there are some complications in a particular case, you may well discuss that. But if you have to begin, what should be the starting point? That should be my starting point, I would tend to think. That may not help you to answer your friends. If you send the friends to me, I'll give them the answer.
At least I'll have you to cite for my answers. That's good enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Xiaolin Wei from Nalanda School of Public Health.
Again, closer.
Okay, yeah. When I was a student 15 years ago, I enjoyed reading your book, Argumentative Indian. And I remember there is a chapter about comparison between China and India. And you stated there are so many different development routes between the two countries, that China is planned economy, but there's lots of state investment, while in India is more kind of economy come from the bottom to the up.
Can you call again? I'm having difficulty.
Okay, I just want
Yeah,
to...
I went once in a nightclub, a singer came, and I was trying to make a point, explained to me that if you want to be heard, the thing to remember is to try to kiss the microphone without actually kissing it.
Okay, I try to kiss it, I'll swallow it. So my question is really regarding, if you look at China-India right now, there are more similarities than differences. For example, both of them face big environmental pollution, and there are big gaps between the rich and poor, while in both countries, the rich are trying to immigrate to the rich countries. I wonder if you want to make some amendment of that chapter in your famous book,
No,
Argumentative Indian.
I don't.
What you would say right now?
I don't. I'll tell you why not. You say that both countries have poor people, and the level of inequality is about the same. They're very similar Gini coefficient. On the other hand, being poor in India means you don't know if you have an illness where you would go, what kind of medical care you could possibly get. You may not have a school within reach, elementary school to which you can go, depending on some parts of it. There are the social safety nets that might save you in a way that it does in China today, and it didn't earlier in China, but it does now, would not apply in India. Now, India, if you read the rest of the book, is also a very diverse country. If you look at a part of India like Kerala, where you have public health service of a similar kind, it began with that, but as the Kerala people grew richer, and the richness was connected with the fact that education and healthcare was so much emphasized in Kerala, just as in China. Now, of course, the public health is supplemented enormously by private health care, as in China too. But you have to reach that stage. Now, the big difference is that the lesson, which I would say is the Asian lesson, and there China wasn't the first country, it was actually Japan, immediately after Meiji Restoration in the 1868, that when they decided, there's a lovely passage at the beginning of the Code of Education saying, and it sounds very odd today, why is it that the Americans are so productive and we Japanese are not productive? It doesn't sound contemporary, I have to tell you. But then he said, the reason is only one thing. Americans and Japanese are much the same. The Americans are educated and we are not. And therefore we ought to change it. And they decided to make Japan completely literate in 40 years, which they did for the younger generation. In India, it's now really a long time, 70 years probably, since independence. We haven't gotten there at all. The idea that education and healthcare is good not only for human life and therefore our human rights, but also very poor shared economic growth is a lesson that hasn't been learned. Now, Kerala, which began with free education and free healthcare in 1960s, I was then teaching in Delhi, and I was one of the few supporters of the plan, and I was told, how could you be so irresponsible to support it? Because Kerala is either the second poorest or the third poorest country in India. To which my answer was that, A, that if you are poor, labor is cheap, and education and healthcare are very labor intensive. So do some comparative cost analysis. And secondly, with education and healthcare, as Adam Smith discussed quite extensively in Wealth of Nations, you will have very rapid economic expansion. Now that last year in the National Sample Survey, Kerala is given the highest per capita expenditure in all India, I would tend to think that some apology is owed to me compared with what was said in the 60s. Now China had the same experience, Korea had the same experience, Japan had the same experience, Hong Kong, Taiwan has the same experience. I think that experience has not been enjoyed by India. And as far as the other thing I discussed, namely multi-party democracy, well, China still isn't a multi-party democracy. And of course, this has its advantages. When China made and disadvantages, when China made a mistake, there was a famine larger than any in recorded history. 30 million people died in the Great Leap Forward famine. When, after the reform, they decided to withdraw citizen insurance by insurance that you have to be that had to be bought. And one step, China moved from a Canada-type system to a US-type system. China, by then, already had about 70 years life expectancy compared with India's 54. But in the following 25 years, China made no progress almost. It moved from 70 to 71. In 2004, after 25 years, they decided to change it. And of course, with the speed with which China comes, change in China comes, by 2012, China was 98% covered medically again, and again, the life expectancies continue to go up. In the intermediate period, India, with all its faults, had caught up. The gap fell from 16 years to being only 7 years. But now the gap is going up again, since the Chinese have both the education, healthcare, and healthcare available to all. There's an advantage there, because it's only about 12 people who have to change their mind in order to do that. Now, as long as India does not follow Mary Wollstonecraft's advice that if you want to get something done, you have to get public discussion going on that and generate a public enthusiasm for it. If you don't follow it, and India has not been able to do it, then you go on to other kinds of issues. Issues, dealing with, well, glitzy things, entertainment with the which quite like. Since one of my daughters is an actress, I quite like seeing her picture. On the other hand, the education, healthcare has not really attracted any attention. Compare that with that the protection of cows have certainly had dramatically important effect. And if you go to India, I would give you practical advice. Leave the cows alone.
We're pretty much at time, so I'm going to abuse my position as chair and ask you, Amartya, a final question, one that I hope will inform the discussions that we have tomorrow. The question is, if we take human rights seriously and we take the right to health seriously, what changes in what we expect a government to do in relation to the social determinants of health?
I think there's not one solution to that, because, there's so many different things. It's like saying that, the food here wasn't really good. We ought to improve that. Now, what culinary advice do you give? Now, I can give you a lot of culinary advice, but it will take a form, a variety of things. And the question of diversity came. Even diversity will figure in that. But I think we need to start in better primary health care and universal primary health care, rather than what happens now. you neglect people in a country like India, where, and then disease develops and a much higher cost, you have to, some people would die. Others would not go to the hospital. Others would try to go to the hospital until their money is run out. Others would get treatment because the government gives RSVI grants, Rashtriya Shastra Yojana, Viman Yojana. That pays money, mostly to private hospitals, to do operations. Vast amount of money is absorbed in that from a very small pool, 1% pool altogether compared with China's 3%. A lot of it goes to cure things or treat things which are not, which need not have arisen if you looked at it earlier. On top of that, the system is a market economy for profit. So what happens? I'm examining a thesis tomorrow morning, and there have been in this week I have had 2 PhDs and one master's thesis. One is actually the exam is not tomorrow. My meeting with the examiners is tomorrow, and the examination is on Tuesday. This is on RSVI, and it turns out that what happens is that there are certain subjects on which it's available, and hospitals really love it. They have agents, they are called dalals, who go around telling patients that you could get your cataract removed, or you could get something else. And we also know of cases where young girls have been told that uterectomy may be a very good thing for you. And it's a very good thing for the hospital, because you get your 30,000 rupees, and you have done, and you have removed the uterus of someone who did not have that, need not have that to be removed. And you know, I very much applaud removing cataracts, and I have had that done too. But that may be at the cost of expensive treatment like cancer. It's the same amount of money. So if you are relying on the market economy for reasons that not any rebellious economist, but standard economists from Adam Smith, Paul Samuelson, Canaro today had been saying the market cannot deliver certain things well. And this lesson is a very important one to go. So that's one of the things. The importance of primary health care, the important thing. The issue of immunization came up. It's absolutely no reason why Bangladesh can have all, nearly everyone, every child immunized, and India cannot, with twice the per capita income. And similarly, there are many other kinds of immunization. And the fact that Pakistan does even worse, namely even polio is not, doesn't make India become second worst, doesn't make it any better. So I think if you're dealing with countries like India, and this remark would apply to many of the countries, not to Rwanda, by the way, in which my friend Paul Farmer was very involved, and it has had almost a doubling of life expectancy, which is almost unheard of in modern experience, but it has been done with such rapidity. So we can do it. The main thing to recognize that it is, health is so important that we salute it, and indeed we use the word salute from it. And anything that requires attention should deserve our attention, no matter who we are, but particularly if you are in the, even for an individual, if you can agitate, you ought to, not to say it's none of my business. And if you are the government, then you have a real responsibility, perfect obligation, to do certain things. And I think It is. You won't get just a list of, kind of premeditated list. I hesitate to use the word meditation. It came out in the context of Buddha's meditation. I would then, since we're finishing, I would end up with my own. I had a serious illness, by the way, when I was young. When I was 18, I had cancer. I had cancer of the mouth. It took me a long time to get it diagnosed. I was staying in a YMCA hostel in Calcutta. I was a student, undergraduate. And my GP, I don't know what they're called here, GP internist, is Canada like Britain or America? Is it what they call GP? Yeah. So GP or internist, they all said nothing. Can I cut it? I was very lucky. I was in the YMCA hostel. So I had a medical student next to me. And I threw those down. I said, look, what is that in the mouth? And he said, well, it could be a tumor. And I said, well, you've really aroused my thought. Can you bring some books? And I diagnosed myself as having squamous cell carcinoma on morphological ground. So eventually, when I managed to, no one will do it. I went into the Chittaranjan Cancer Hospital. I was lucky. It was started 5 years earlier, a government hospital. It was opened with much fanfare by Marie Curie's daughter, who opened it. And I was, I think, third or fourth case of radiation treatment there. And I remember sitting down with the doctor and I was very involved in maths and stats then. And he would say, look, my main doctor who gave me was in charge was a gynecologist, which is one of the things I did not need. And on the other hand, my radiologist was very interested in it, and he was studying these books, and we sat together. I was 18, and I could have pretty much passed an exam at that time on carcinoma. And then we decided what we were looking for is minimum that will kill the disease, and not, by the way, not all squamous cell carcinomas respond to radiation, and maximum that you can take without being killed. So I explained to him that it's a well-known class of problems called the minimax problem, and I gave him the general algorithm for going about checking that. And then I had it, nearly died, but didn't quite. And then I was left with the problem that my palate was gone, necrotic, because it killed the disease, but it generated the palate will decline. Some of it got covered up, but some of it remains today. And I have to do many different things whenever I go anywhere. It's a problem because I have to put some medication, etc. Because of, since it's being survived by a plate, not by my own. I prefer to have my own palate, but I don't have it. And it's very difficult to say that if you go somewhere, that you need a medication break. I said that when I was in Japan, and I said that I want to take some medicine. I need some medication break. And they gave me one of those Japanese 8 to 6 programs. Get up at 8 and then be there at 6. I said, no, I have to go to my hotel and apply medication. And the chap of my host said, so what is medication? What is medication break? What is medication break? So I said, well, it is. I don't know how to explain to you. It is medication break. And they said, oh, I understand. Meditation break. And I immediately thought this was the way out. I said, yes, meditation break. And he said, oh, yes, everyone needs to meditate once a day at least. So ever since that, there has been no further problem. Whenever I arrive, I see that well-prepared guests write down various things like no sweet wine, meditation break, and so on. So that's the closest to meditation I come. So there's no premeditated solution I can give you. Thank you. to get by.